Could you say a little bit more about this idea of neurodiversity and how it relates to Neanderthals?
We have in our own population a variety of individuals who cover a spectrum of neurodiversity, meaning that the high-functioning autistics, dyslexics, even bipolar have been major world leaders and thought leaders despite or possibly because of their neurodiversity.
The Neanderthal has actually left traces in the genome of modern humans.
There are several areas related to mental development, for example, mutations which lead to autism or schizophrenia.
We might find additional highly optimal, these are not like these are mutants.
We see that autistics are not only intact, but they happen to be superior.
Some of the ways in which autistics are superior to normal people would be useful for science.
Considered autistics as perceptual experts.
So they're perceptual experts?
They are perceptual experts.
And the face is also stuck forward, really far relative to the brain case.
When comparing boys with autism to typically developing boys, she found significant differences in face shape.
They have a broader mouth. The divot above the upper lip seems to be broader, as well as sort of the mid-face region.
The brains of children with autism are actually larger.
The brain development of modern human babies differs significantly from that of the Neanderthals.
Neanderthals did have bigger brains than us, but they didn't have bigger brains than the people who followed them in Europe. Those people's brains were expanding.
The modern human with a Neanderthal, this Neanderthal skull just goes back and back on the occipital cortex, the part that's related to vision.
And I used to joke around about having a gigantic internet trunk line going deep into my visual cortex.
Being attracted by symmetry is something that has been commented a lot about Neanderthals.
It appears that they were made by Neanderthal as opposed to Homo sapiens. We didn't really think that Neanderthal made art. And so, yes, we're not sure, but this is also 10,000 years older than the other oldest pieces of art we knew about.
Since he was a toddler, Dane has been able to draw with extraordinary precision.
When he was 11, he drew a perfect aerial view of London, after only one helicopter ride. Even the number of windows in all the major buildings in his drawing was correct.
This, of course, implies that they probably didn't swim. They probably had some pretty sophisticated boats to get there.
People have described this object for the production of music by Neanderthals.
What about YMCA? Let's switch to a Russian dance.
Different populations of people, for example, Europeans and Chinese people, have different Neanderthal genes. There are a number of things that I have that came from Neanderthals. One of the things is a part of the androgen receptor, increases the likelihood of baldness.
Published this year, the androgen receptor gene associated with autism.
Now, there's a psychologist at Cambridge University, Simon Baron-Cohen. He writes of the male mind and the female mind.
Children with autism show faster brain development, and when you actually compare different parts of the brain, some structures fit this extreme male pattern.
And at first, the only language that I had for it was gender. But then I started to notice that some men had these traits and some women did not at all. That's when I realized it was actually introversion and extroversion, and that there was no real language for talking about questions of identity.
More autistic children are born to MIT graduates. There's more autism here in Silicon Valley. The sort of nasty conclusion from this is that too much mathematical ability is bad for your children.
Those creatures on Earth who reached a very high level of social organization.
That'd be us.
That's us. And the social insects.
Right. That'd be ants.
You find it not only in people, but you find it in simple animals, some of which, like ants, build complex society.
Through their work with diverse ant species, Albuhaif and his team reveal that super soldier-like traits can lay dormant and be induced by exposing larvae to an overdose of a naturally occurring hormone.
Simon Baron-Cohen has pretty good data that it's the fetal testosterone.
Testosterone seems to have organizational effects on brain development.
There are 8 species known as super soldiers because they're much larger and they even have larger heads and a larger body. They use their large heads to block the nest entrance when attacked by army ants. Phenotypes that get induced in populations that reflect these kind of ancestral traits. Previously, evolutionary biologists had treated them as sort of the Barnum and Bailey of evolution, or some kind of slips of a developmental system. And what we're showing here is that no, the fact that we can induce it reflects some deep underlying potential that goes back to the ancestor. So the ancestor must have had this trait, It lost the expression of the trait, but it retained this genetic potential. When a queen lays an egg, if it receives the right temperature cues, it becomes a queen. If not, that egg develops into a worker. If it gets the proper nutrition, it develops into a soldier. And these switches during development are governed by a hormone called juvenile hormone.
In humans as well as other animals, the hormone does its work by binding to androgen receptors, which are all over the body, but are also found in the brain.
Parts of the motor systems are committed to social behavior. They are mirroring your behavior.
Suggesting possibly autism may have something to do with mirror neurons.
In fact, in our hominid ancestry, males and females occupied very different niches, with females taking much more of a social role, and with males having a much more of a solitary role.
There would be very little point in having a mirror system if you lived on your own. There'd be a lot of point in having a digestive system, having a movement system, having a visual system if you lived on your own, but there'd be no point in having a mirror system.
How do you determine who does it and who doesn't do it?
That's the accidents of evolutionary history.
There's another type of evolution where two organisms come together to make one.
It's a process called introgression. We have more than a dozen Neanderthals from whom we've got complete mitochondrial DNA sequences.
But because mitochondria replicate themselves in a separate fashion, it doesn't get mixed with the DNA of the father. It's just the mother's mitochondrial DNA.
Their mitochondrial sequences are all distinct from ours.
Because after all, when two groups meet each other and there's some social inequality, one almost always mixes, but the offspring will generally stay with one or the other group.
This is a rapidly evolving field. It also seems to be why a number of hybrid crosses, for example, between a horse and a donkey, give rise to a mule that is sterile because of the incompatibility of the mitochondria with the nuclear DNA.
The mitochondrial DNA must itself have been affected in its evolution by its function.
In the first committed steps of innate immunity.
They found that the Neanderthals had particular gene variants that play a big role in immune defense.
It looked as though there were alleles that came into the modern human population. The downside was that it gave a greater risk of not being able to control the end of the response to infection and leading to autoimmunity.
He says that could explain the increasing prevalence of diseases like lupus, celiac disease and autoimmune hepatitis.
Children with mothers who had celiac disease were nearly 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with autism. Juvenile diabetes was also associated with a higher risk of autism, and children with mothers who had rheumatoid arthritis were also at a 70% increased risk for autism.
And so we're having to readapt to this changing environment.
Well, this architecture creates problems for our genome.
We and many other people around the world are onto something by looking at these copy number variants.
There may have been a copy number difference between the Neanderthal and the reference human genome sequence.
They're going to be in these parts of the genome that used to be called junk DNA.
We have the genes that once enabled our ancestors to have as good a sense of smell as dogs, but the genes have mostly been turned off.
Isn't that the premise of X-Men?
It was analyzed as a Tourette's and Asperger's, which I still have a little bit today.
In hunter-gatherers, they don't have bosses. When somebody tries to be a boss, they make merciless fun of you.
In mutual knowledge, A knows X, B knows X, A knows that B knows X, B knows that A knows X, A knows that B knows. When the little boy said the emperor is naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything that they didn't already know. He was nonetheless changing the state of their knowledge, because everyone now knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew, and that gave them the collective power to challenge the dominance of the emperor through their laughter.
Kids with autism produce pretty much only one kind of laugh. Like in our conversation right now, if I say something dumb, you might kind of... And you don't really feel good inside, but you've learned to sort of grease the social wheels in this context. Kids with autism, I don't think that they're probably picking up on those subtle social cues. They're genuine, so they just laugh when they feel good. Kids are producing these sounds that may actually influence others positively.
Simpler forms of empathy may predate human beings, which should come as no surprise.
Is it unrealistic for them to hope or think that that child loves them, as some might most wish?
Well, let me tell you, that child will be loyal, and if your house is burning down, they're going to get you out of it.